The sun hung low in the sky as the group made their way toward the forest's edge. Silent Bend was a place they'd only heard about in passing, a tiny speck of a town at the base of a mountain range, far from any tourist route. When Jake had suggested they explore a hidden trail there, the group had jumped at the opportunity. But now, as they passed the last few houses at the town's perimeter, something felt off. The locals had been distant, almost evasive when asked about the forest. There was a strange quietness in their responses, and the occasional hollow stare, as though words weren't necessary. Just silence. No warnings, no directions, just that eerie sense of unease left hanging in the air. But Jake, always the adventurer, brushed it off. Sarah had joked that small-town folk were always superstitious, while Greg and Lisa agreed. Mark was quiet, as usual, his face betraying nothing. The trailhead was barely visible, overgrown and unmarked, as though nature itself was trying to conceal it. Twisted branches formed an arch overhead, their dark leaves rustling faintly in the wind, beckoning the group forward. For the first hour, it was everything they'd hoped for, serene and untouched. The only sounds were their footsteps on the soft dirt and the occasional rustle of wildlife in the underbrush. As the canopy thickened overhead, the light dimmed, giving the forest a greenish, underwater hue. But soon things began to change. Lisa was the first to notice it. An old, decrepit campsite just off the trail. The fire pit was nothing more than a ring of stones, blackened and cold, with a few tattered remains of what might have been fabric. Now nothing more than threads. "Looks ancient," she muttered, her fingers brushing the stones. Jake barely glanced at it, already moving ahead. Sarah and Greg exchanged a glance but said nothing, their excitement still masking the growing discomfort. The second campsite appeared not long after, this one more intact but equally lifeless. The firewood, though half burned, looked fresh, as though someone had abandoned it mid-camp. A forgotten backpack lay nearby, its straps frayed, covered in mildew. The deeper they went, the more unsettling the atmosphere became. It wasn't just the campsites, it was the silence. The once tranquil forest had grown unnaturally quiet, the only sound being the crunch of leaves beneath their boots. Even the birds had stopped chirping. As they moved further in, the air grew thicker, almost heavy with something unspoken. The wind, which had been steady earlier, died completely, leaving the trees utterly still, their long limbs twisted like skeletal fingers reaching toward the sky. Sarah felt it first, a sensation that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. A sense of being watched. She tried to shake it off, but it lingered. "Anyone else feel like we're not alone?" she whispered to Greg, who gave a nervous chuckle. "It's just your imagination," he replied, though his eyes darted to the shadowy tree line. But deep down, they both felt it, a presence like the forest itself was observing them, waiting. The day wore on and the trail grew narrower, the dense foliage now so thick it brushed their arms as they walked. The path itself had begun to fade, as though it hadn't been used in years, possibly decades. Jake, ever determined, led the group deeper still, but even he seemed more cautious now, his eyes scanning the thickening gloom ahead. By the time the sun began to dip toward the horizon, an oppressive stillness had taken over. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of a branch made them jump. There was no denying it now. Something wasn't right about this place. They finally made camp at the base of a steep ridge, a small clearing that offered some comfort with its open sky and sparse trees. But even as they set up their tents, the silence pressed down on them. Mark, who had barely spoken all day, stood at the edge of the camp, staring into the darkening forest. "What do you see?" Jake called over, trying to lighten the mood. Mark didn't answer, he just stood there, eyes fixed on the woods, as though listening for something only he could hear. The sun dipped behind the ridge, casting long, twisted shadows across the clearing, and the air grew colder. The group sat around the fire, its flickering light the only warmth in the encroaching darkness. But no one felt like talking anymore. The excitement that had fueled their hike had been replaced by a gnawing sense of unease. It wasn't just the silence now, it was what lay beyond it. Something in the forest was aware of them, and it was getting closer. As the last sliver of daylight disappeared, they heard it for the first time, a soft, rhythmic thudding coming from somewhere deep in the trees. Mark was the first to stand, his face pale in the firelight. His eyes never left the forest, but his voice, when he finally spoke, was barely a whisper. "We shouldn't be here." And then, just as quickly, the noise stopped and silence fell once more. The fire crackled weakly as the night swallowed the forest, leaving only the pale flicker of flames to push back the encroaching darkness. The rhythmic thudding they'd heard earlier had stopped, but its echo seemed to linger in the air, a phantom noise buried beneath the silence. The group sat close to the fire, but no one spoke. Their nerves were raw, each of them feeling the same oppressive weight from the forest, but none wanting to voice it. The night was unnervingly quiet. No insects, no rustling of leaves, not even the faint whisper of the wind. Just silence, deep and unnatural, as though the forest had chosen to fall into a slumber. But within that silence, something watched. Mark was the first to break from the group, his eyes wide, unfocused. He stood at the edge of the firelight, his back to the others, staring out into the pitch-black trees. Sarah glanced at him uneasily. "Mark, you okay?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He didn't respond, his body still like a statue, his gaze locked on the darkness ahead. Jake, who had been trying to poke at the fire to keep it alive, looked over his shoulder. "Leave him be," he muttered, but even he sounded unsure. Mark had always been the quiet type, but this was different. There was something wrong. Suddenly, from the depths of the forest, a sound pierced the silence. A soft, almost imperceptible whispering, like the faintest voice carried on a non-existent breeze. It wasn't words, not exactly, but a fragmented murmur, just on the edge of hearing. Lisa tensed, her eyes darting toward the trees. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. Sarah nodded, her breath catching in her throat. "Yeah, what is that?" Before anyone could answer, Mark stepped forward, walking away from the campfire and into the darkness. His movements were slow and deliberate, as though in a trance, his steps soundless on the forest floor. Jake shot up from his seat, heart pounding. "Mark, where the hell are you going?" There was no response. Mark's figure disappeared into the shadowy trees, swallowed by the blackness without so much as a glance back. Panic surged through the group. Jake grabbed his flashlight and followed after him, calling Mark's name, but the beam barely penetrated the thick darkness of the forest. The others followed quickly behind, their footsteps heavy with fear. The forest had taken on an entirely different character at night. Its once peaceful presence now felt suffocating, hostile. The trees seemed to lean in closer, their gnarled branches stretching out like arms, closing in on them. As they moved deeper into the forest, the whispering sound grew louder, though it remained unintelligible, like hundreds of faint voices talking at once. They called out for Mark, their voices desperate, but he never answered. The flashlight beams swept across the dense undergrowth, casting long, jagged shadows that flickered and danced in the darkness. But Mark was nowhere to be seen. "Where the hell did he go?" Greg asked, his voice breaking with tension. "I don't know," Jake replied, his jaw clenched, but his voice was filled with an edge of disbelief. Mark couldn't have gone far, yet the forest seemed to swallow sound, making it impossible to tell how far away he might be. He was just here. He was right here. And then, out of nowhere, the whispering stopped. The silence that followed was so absolute, it was like a weight pressing down on their chests. They stood frozen, breaths held, as the quiet closed in around them like a living thing. Every fiber of their being screamed that something was wrong, deeply wrong. The fire, far behind them now, was just a faint glow through the thick trees. They were too far out to see it, and Mark was gone. Suddenly, there was a rustling sound from the bushes, quick and frantic. The group turned toward the noise, their flashlights darting across the forest floor. For a brief second, they saw something, just the flash of a figure, or maybe a shadow, moving swiftly between the trees of us. "Did you see that?" Lisa gasped, her hand gripping Greg's arm so tightly her knuckles turned white. I don't know. What was that?" Sarah stammered, her eyes wide with fear. Jake took a step forward, his heart pounding in his ears. "Mark!" he called again, but his voice wavered. The forest had begun to warp around them, the trees no longer familiar or comforting, but menacing, twisted into strange, unnatural shapes. And still there was no sign of their friend. Then, out of the silence, came a single, unmistakable sound. Mark's voice, distant and weak, calling for help. The group froze, their eyes locking on each other. "Did you hear that?" Greg asked, his voice barely a whisper. Jake nodded, his flashlight scanning the trees ahead. Yeah, it's Mark, he's out there. But something about the voice didn't feel right. It was too distant, too faint, like it wasn't coming from the right direction. Lisa felt her stomach turn, an icy chill creeping up her spine. No, something's wrong, she whispered. That didn't sound like him, but there was no time to debate. The voice came again, louder this time, and more insistent. Help me! They had no choice but to follow it. Jake pushed ahead, forcing his way through the underbrush, his flashlight beam darting from tree to tree. The others followed, their fear growing with every step. The forest was changing, closing in around them. The trees seemed closer, their branches tangled in unnatural shapes, and the air was colder now, almost icy. And yet, no matter how far they walked, they couldn't find Mark. Finally, after what felt like hours, the voice stopped. Jake turned in circles, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts. Mark, he yelled, but there was no answer. Only silence. They were lost, deep in the forest now, far from where they had started, and their friend was gone. The forest stood still, an ancient, patient thing that had trapped them within its embrace. They had ventured too far, and now it was watching them, waiting. The fire was a distant memory, the safety of the campsite a dream. They were alone in the woods, surrounded by something far older and far darker than they could ever have imagined. The night stretched on, endless and soundless, as the group huddled together, their fear growing with every second. Whatever had taken Mark was still out there, and it was getting closer. The forest felt like it had swallowed them whole. The group stood in the darkness, their flashlights flickering weakly, casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to move on their own. Every step they took seemed to lead them deeper into the belly of the woods, farther from the safety of the campsite, farther from the world they knew. The only constant was the growing dread that pulsed through their veins, a deep, unshakable feeling that something in the forest had turned its gaze on them. They had lost Mark. Hours had passed since they last heard his voice, and now they were hopelessly disoriented, the familiar trail gone, the trees a dense, impenetrable wall. The whispers, too, had stopped, leaving a silence that was even more unnerving. It was as if the forest had grown tired of its games and was now waiting for something far worse. We need to turn back, Sarah said, her voice trembling, her flashlight beam shaking as she scanned the woods. We can't keep going. We're lost. Jake, the unofficial leader, was breathing heavily, his usual confidence eroding as the hours ticked by. We'll find Mark, he insisted, though even he didn't seem to believe his own words. We just have to. A sound cut him off, faint at first, then growing louder. A slow, steady thud, 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 like something heavy being dragged through the underbrush. It was coming from behind them, from the direction of the campsite, though it felt wrong, distant yet uncomfortably close. What is that? Lisa whispered, her face pale in the dim light. She was gripping Greg's arm, her fear now palpable. No one answered. They didn't need to. Whatever was making that noise wasn't Mark, and they all knew it. The group moved quickly, almost stumbling over themselves as they turned away from the sound, heading deeper into the woods. They weren't running yet, but the urgency in their steps was unmistakable. The trees grew thicker, the branches clawing at their clothes, pulling them into the frena's twisted labyrinth. Sarah was at the back of the group, her breathing shallow, heart pounding. The feeling of being watched had grown stronger, like invisible eyes were boring into her back with every step. She turned once, briefly, to look behind them, and for a moment, just a fraction of a second, she saw something move between the trees. It wasn't human and it wasn't an animal. A shape, tall and thin, melted into the shadows before she could make it out. Go faster, she urged, her voice barely above a whisper. It's coming. The others didn't need convincing. They stumbled through the undergrowth, the uneven ground making it hard to stay upright. Every tree looked the same, every bush an obstacle in their path. It felt like the forest itself was closing in on them, bending and twisting, guiding them deeper into its heart. The cold had become bone-chilling, the air so thick it felt like they were breathing through wet cloth. And then they heard it. Mark's voice again, faint, distant, but unmistakable. Help! Please, help me! Jake froze in his tracks. That's him, he said, his voice sharp with desperation. He's still out there. But Sarah grabbed through his arm, shaking her head violently. No, that's not him. That can't be him. She had a look in her eyes that made Jake pause. Utter terror. He's dead. Greg and Lisa exchanged a horrified glance. The group had seen enough horror movies to know what Sarah meant, but it was a different thing entirely to feel it. The forest wasn't just playing tricks on them, it was mimicking, using their friend's voice like bait. "We can't keep going toward it," Sarah continued, her voice breaking. "It's leading us somewhere. It's a trap." Jake looked torn. He wanted to believe that Mark was still alive, that he could still save him. But deep down, they all felt the truth gnawing at them. Mark was gone, and whatever had taken him was trying to lure them deeper into the darkness. The voice came again, louder this time, more insistent. "Help me! I'm hurt!" Without warning, Jake broke into a run. "Mark, hold on, I'm coming!" he shouted, tearing through the trees, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly as he sprinted toward the sound. "Jake, no!" Sarah screamed, but it was too late. He was already disappearing into the thick underbrush, the light from his flashlight growing fainter and fainter until it was swallowed by the forest. "Damn it!" Greg hissed, his voice trembling. "We can't let him go alone." They chased after him, their own fear momentarily forgotten in the surge of panic. Branches clawed at their faces and arms as they ran, the forest warping around them, twisting into a maze of tangled roots and gnarled trees. The air grew colder still, biting at their exposed skin. But no matter how fast they ran, no matter how loud they called Jake's name, they couldn't catch up to him. His voice faded into the distance, the echoes of his frantic shouts bouncing off the trees. The forest was pulling them apart, separating them like prey scattered before a predator. They stumbled into a clearing, panting and disoriented. The ground was uneven, littered with old, weathered traps, rusted metal snares hidden beneath layers of dead leaves, some still sharp, others half buried in the earth. Sarah nearly tripped over one, her flashlight revealing the jagged teeth of the trap, stained with something dark and old. Where did he go?" Lisa gasped, her breath hitching as she clung to Greg's arm. Greg shook his head, his face pale. I don't know. A scream cut through the air. Jake's scream, raw, terrified, and cut short by something horrible. They all froze, their blood running cold. It wasn't the scream of someone lost or hurt. It was the scream of someone who had seen something unspeakable, something that didn't belong in this world. And then, nothing. Just silence again. They stood there, paralyzed by fear, the weight of the forest pressing down on them like a living thing. Whatever had happened to Jake, they knew it was over. He was gone, just like Mark. Tears filled Lisa's eyes. "What is this place?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "What's happening to us?" Sarah couldn't answer. She could only stare into the darkness, her mind racing, trying to make sense of the madness that had overtaken them. The forest wasn't just a place anymore. It was alive, aware, and it had them exactly where it wanted them. The clearing felt like a dead zone, a place where life had been extinguished long ago, leaving only the rusted snares and twisted trias as a reminder of something long forgotten. The cold air wrapped around the remaining three like a shroud, dampening every breath and movement. They stood in stunned silence, Lisa sobbing quietly, while Sarah and Greg stared into the abyss of the forest, minds racing with dread. Jake's screams still echoed in their ears, but the forest had swallowed him whole, leaving no trace. The woods seemed to grow tighter around them, the towering trees bending in closer as if listening to their fear, feeding on it. Sarah's skin crawled with the sensation of being watched, but there was no movement, no sound, just the endless, suffocating silence. "We have to go," Greg said finally, his voice raw and trembling. "We can't stay here. This place, it's wrong." Sarah nodded, her mind screaming with every fiber of instinct to get out, to run, but where? The trail was gone, swallowed by the forest hours ago. The campsite was a distant memory, and Jake and Mark, gone. The forest had taken them both, lured them deeper with false promises, and now it was watching, waiting for its next victim. Lisa's sobs grew louder, her body shaking uncontrollably. "We're going to die here," she whimpered. "We're never going to get out. We're trapped." "No," Sarah said firmly, though her voice cracked under the weight of her own terror. "We're not. We just need to keep moving, together." Greg, pale and on the edge of panic, nodded in agreement, though it was clear he was barely holding it together. They had to believe there was still a way out, that the forest hadn't completely trapped them yet. They needed to keep moving, to stay ahead of whatever was stalking them. But as they turned to leave the clearing, the sound returned. A low, rhythmic thud, 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 like the beating of a giant heart buried deep beneath the earth. It seemed to vibrate through the trees, rattling their bones, making their hair stand on end. The ground felt unsteady beneath their feet, as if something massive and unseen was moving below the surface. The sound wasn't far this time, it was all around them. Lisa's eyes widened in terror. "What is that?" she gasped, clutching Greg's arm like a lifeline. "I don't know," he whispered, his face pale as he glanced around, trying to pinpoint the source of the noise. "It's everywhere." They hurried into the trees, leaving the clearing behind, but the noise followed them, growing louder with every step. The forest itself seemed to pulse with the sound, the trees vibrating in time with the relentless thudding, their trunks swaying unnaturally as if they were breathing, alive in the most horrific way. As they pushed forward, the landscape began to shift around them, the forest warping into something darker, more twisted. The ground became uneven, the roots of the trees rising up like the ridged bones of a giant, ancient creature, forcing them to navigate a maze of tangled limbs and gnarled branches. Every step was treacherous, every sound amplified by the deafening silence in between the rhythmic thuds. And then they saw it, a structure barely visible through the dense fog that had begun to creep through the forest, wrapping itself around the trees like ghostly fingers. It stood alone in the darkness, an old cabin, its wooden walls sagging with age, the windows broken and black as if they led to nothing but void. "We should keep going," Greg muttered, his voice thick with dread. "That place looks wrong." But Sarah felt an inexplicable pull toward the cabin. It was the only structure they had seen, the only thing that hinted at civilization in this nightmarish forest. "We need to check it out," she said quietly, her flashlight flickering as it swept across the decaying wood. "There might be supplies. A way to figure out where we are." Greg was hesitant, but they had no better options. The forest had turned into a labyrinth around them, and the deeper they ventured, the more disoriented they became. The only way to survive was to confront whatever was waiting for them. As they approached the cabin, the air grew colder, and a faint, almost imperceptible whispering began again, like before. This time it was coming from within the cabin walls, low, indistinct voices that ebbed and flowed with the breeze. Sarah felt her heart quicken, her hands trembling as she reached for the door. It was half-rotted, hanging loosely on its rusted hinges, and creaked ominously as she pushed it open. Inside, the darkness was suffocating. The air was thick with the stench of rot and decay, as if something had died here long ago and never left. The floorboards groaned under their weight as they stepped inside, flashlights sweeping the interior. Dust hung heavy in the air, disturbed by their movements, and every corner of the cabin seemed filled with shadows that shifted just beyond the edge of the light. But what caught Sarah's eye, what made her heart drop into her stomach, was the trap door in the center of the room. It was slightly ajar, the wood splintered and cracked, as if someone or something had forced it open from below. A draft of cold air drifted up from the darkness beneath, carrying with it the faint sound of whispering, now louder, clearer. It was unmistakably human but garbled, distorted, like a chorus of voices speaking all at once, overlapping, blending together into a single maddening hum. Greg and Lisa stayed frozen at the door, unwilling to step further into the room. Sarah felt her stomach churn with dread, but something was pulling her toward the trap door, something deep and primal, as if the forest itself was drawing her in. Her flashlight beam trembled as she aimed it toward the dark hole beneath the door. "I don't think we should go down there," Greg whispered, his face pale. "This is wrong, Sarah. We need to leave." But Sarah couldn't tear her gaze away. The whispering was louder now, beckoning, seductive in its twisted familiarity. "We have to know," she whispered back, though the words felt empty. She wasn't sure what she hoped to find. Answers, salvation, maybe even a trace of Mark or Jake. But deep down, she knew that whatever lay beneath that trapdoor was far older, far darker than anything they had faced so far. Without another word, she stepped forward, her fingers brushing the edge of the trapdoor. Sarah's fingers hesitated on the splintered edge of the trapdoor, her breath catching in her throat. The whispering had grown louder, more insistent, as though the voices below were clawing their way to the surface, desperate to be heard. A foul, earthy smell rose from the darkness, thick and nauseating, like soil turned over after something had rotted beneath it for far too long. Behind her, Greg and Lisa stood frozen, their faces pale with fear. They were barely holding on to their sanity, the weight of the forest pressing down on them, suffocating. It was as though the cabin wasn't just a structure anymore, but a part of the forest itself, an extension of its ancient, malevolent will. An extension of its... "Sarah, don't!" Greg whispered, his voice strained. "We need to get out of here, now!" But it was too late. The trapdoor creaked as Sarah lifted it open, revealing a narrow, dark passageway that descended into the earth. Her flashlight beam cut through the gloom, illuminating a rough-hewn tunnel lined with damp roots that twisted through the dirt like veins. The whispering echoed up from the depths, louder now, clearer. Though still unintelligible, it carried with it the weight of countless voices, all trapped, all pleading. Lisa whimpered, backing away toward the door. "Please, let's go. I don't want to die here." Sarah didn't respond. Something beyond fear, beyond rational thought, was pulling her into the tunnel, an unseen force that gripped her mind and urged her forward. She could feel it deep within her bones. The forest wanted them here. It had lured them to this place, guided them into its heart, and now it was ready to show its true nature. Without thinking, Sarah began to descend the rickety wooden ladder, her flashlight gripped tightly in her hand. The walls of the tunnel closed in around her, the air growing colder, thicker with the smell of decay. The whispers grew louder, swirling around her like a living thing, brushing against her ears, filling her spine with a low hum of despair. Greg's voice echoed down after her. "Sarah, wait, don't do this." But she couldn't stop. Her feet moved of their own accord, her body no longer under her control. She reached the bottom of the ladder and stepped into a small chamber. Carved out of the earth, the walls lined with rotting wood and roots that pulsed with a sickly, unnatural life. The whispering was deafening now, an overwhelming cacophony of voices that made her head spin. The beam of her flashlight flickered, casting long shadows across the room. And then she saw them. In the center of the chamber stood a massive ancient tree, its gnarled trunk twisted and blackened with age, its roots sprawling out in all directions like the fingers of some ancient god. But this tree was not like the others in the forest. This one was different. Dark, unnatural symbols were carved into its bark, glowing faintly with a sickly green light. The air around it was thick with an oppressive energy that made her skin crawl, her breath come in short, shallow gasps. At the base of the tree, half buried in the earth, were bones, hundreds of them. Skulls, rib cages, and shattered limbs, all tangled together in a grotesque display of death. Some were ancient, little more than brittle fragments of bone, while others were disturbingly fresh, still wrapped in decaying flesh. Sarah's flashlight shook as she realized what she was looking at. A mass grave, hidden beneath the roots of the forest. And then she saw the bodies. They were half submerged in the earth, their faces frozen in expressions of terror, their hands reaching upward as though they had been trying to claw their way out. Among them, Sarah saw familiar faces. Mark, Jake. Their bodies were twisted, contorted in unnatural positions, their eyes wide open, staring blankly into the dark. Sarah's scream caught in her throat. Her friends? They had been claimed by the forest, consumed by whatever ancient force dwelled within this place. Their bodies had been absorbed into the roots, their souls trapped within the whispers that filled the air. The tree, it was feeding on them. Suddenly, Sarah felt the ground beneath her shift. The roots of the tree began to move, writhing like snakes, slowly uncoiling from the earth. They slithered across the floor, reaching toward her, their movements deliberate and hungry. The whispers grew louder still, now accompanied by the soft, sickening sound of wet soil shifting as the forest reached out to claim her, just as it had claimed the others. Panicked, Sarah stumbled back, her flashlight flickering wildly. She turned to flee, but the tunnel behind her was closing, the roots twisting together to form a solid wall, trapping her inside the chamber with the monstrous tree. She was cornered, alone in the dark with the thing that had been watching them all along. Her heart raced, her mind frantic as the roots inched closer, wrapping around her ankles, pulling her toward the tree. She screamed, kicking at the tendrils, but they were relentless, their grip tightening with every moment. She could feel the cold, pulsing energy seeping into her skin, pulling her down into the earth, into the waiting maw of the forest. Above in the cabin, Greg and Lisa heard her scream. "Sarah!" Greg yelled, but there was no answer, only the sound of wood creaking and the whispers growing louder by the second. "We have to get her out of there," Lisa cried, her face streaked with tears. Greg grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the trapdoor. No, we can't," he stammered, his voice shaking with fear. "We have to go. We have to get out of here, now. This place, it's killing us, Lisa. We can't save her." Lisa stared at him in horror. "We can't just leave her." But as they argued, the cabin itself seemed to shift. The walls groaned, the floorboards creaked beneath their feet, and the air grew thick with the same oppressive energy that had consumed Sarah. The forest was closing in on them too, and the whispers were no longer distant. They were inside the cabin, surrounding them. The cabin door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The roots began to creep up through the floor, twisting around their feet, crawling toward the walls, the ceiling. The forest wasn't just trapping Sarah, it was trapping them all. Lisa let out a scream as the roots wrapped around her legs, pulling her down. Greg tried to pull her free, but it was no use. The forest was alive, and it was hungry. The last thing they saw before the roots claimed them was the ancient tree, its bark glowing faintly in the dark, the faces of the lost etched into its gnarled surface. And then the whispers stopped. The forest stood still, silent once again, as if nothing had ever happened. The clearing where the cabin had stood was empty now, overgrown with thick brush and tangled vines. The hikers were gone, consumed by the ancient hunger of the forest. All that remained were the whispers, faint, barely audible, carried on the wind, a reminder of those who had wandered too far into the woods and never returned. The forest was patient. It would wait. It always did. The sun dipped low in the sky as Lena parked her car beside the overgrown dirt road leading to Valewood. The vibrant hues of autumn leaves fluttered like confetti around her, yet an unsettling stillness blanketed the forest ahead, in unexpected contrast to the crisp, lively air. She glanced at the faded sign warning of danger beyond, its edges frayed and forgotten by time. For most, it would have been a deterrent. For Lena, it was an invitation. As she stepped into the forest, the atmosphere shifted. Shadows danced between the trees, and the warm glow of the sun dimmed, swallowed by the dense canopy overhead. With every step deeper into Valewood, the outside world faded, replaced by the enchanting sounds of rustling leaves and distant bird calls. The air felt thick with moisture, as if the trees were exhaling a breath that mingled with the earthy scent of damp soil. Lena's heart raced with anticipation. She had spent countless nights reading about the forest and the rare Pteridium obscura. The ferns were said to harbor unusual properties, a legend wrapped in folklore that whispered of discovery and danger. Yet the thrill of potential knowledge outweighed her apprehension. She felt a connection to the ancient trees around her, their gnarled roots grasping at the earth like hands clinging to secrets long forgotten. Hours melted away as Lena immersed herself in the wonders of the forest. She meticulously documented every plant and flower she encountered, their names rolling off her tongue like incantations. The forest revealed its treasures, but with each discovery, an undercurrent of unease gnawed at her, an instinct that something was amiss. The whispers of the wind seemed to beckon her deeper, urging her to uncover the forest's hidden mysteries. It was near midday when she finally stumbled upon the rare fern, nestled among the moss-covered stones. Pteridium obscura gleamed darkly against the vibrant green backdrop, its fronds glistening with droplets of dew, as if it were alive and breathing. Lena's pulse quickened, and she knelt to sketch it, her fingers trembling with excitement as she carefully traced its unique shape. But as she immersed herself in her work, an unsettling feeling washed over her. The forest, once a sanctuary of beauty, now felt charged with something darker. A fleeting shadow flickered at the corner of her vision, and when she turned her head, there was nothing but the fluttering leaves in the wind. Shrugging it off, Lena focused on the fern, but the sensation lingered, an inkling of being watched. The sun dipped lower, casting elongated shadows that seemed to stretch toward her. Unfazed, she pulled out her phone to snap a picture, but the screen flickered, momentarily revealing static instead of the tranquil forest scene. Confusion prickled at her mind, but she dismissed it as a glitch, eager to document her discovery. As dusk crept in, a soft rustling drew her attention. Lena looked up to see a small, overgrown path just beyond the fern, barely visible among the underbrush. It beckoned to her, an invitation wrapped in the allure of the unknown. Curiosity tugged at her heart, drowning out the warnings of caution that flickered in her mind. What could lie beyond? More rare plants? Hidden wonders? With her heart pounding in anticipation, Lena stepped onto the path, unaware that she was venturing deeper into a world where nature's beauty could turn into something far more sinister. The shadows seemed to close in behind her, and a soft sigh of wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the remnants of warnings long forgotten. As she journeyed deeper into Valewood, the thrill of discovery blinded her to the lurking darkness, a prelude to the horrors waiting just beyond her grasp. Each step felt like a pact made with the forest, binding her closer to the secrets it held, secrets that could shatter the very essence of who she was. With that first step down the path, Lena unwittingly sealed her fate, a single action echoing through the ancient woods, calling forth the shadows that had long slumbered in the depths of Valewood. The path wound like a serpent through the dense foliage, each turn revealing an uncanny stillness that felt almost tangible. Lena felt as if she were moving through a dream, the air thick with an otherworldly quality that made her skin prickle. The trees closed in around her, their branches arching overhead like skeletal hands reaching for the sky, casting eerie shapes against the deepening twilight. As she ventured further, Lena could sense the first transforming. The rich, earthy scent of damp soil mingled with a faint, metallic tang in the air. It was unsettling, as though the forest was alive, breathing with a life of its own. The sunlight dwindled, filtering through the canopy and fractured beams that illuminated the dust motes swirling in the air. But the shadows grew bolder, creeping closer with every step. An unsettling stillness hung over her like a shroud. The sounds of the forest had dulled to an unsettling silence. The birds that had once chirped merrily were now conspicuously absent, and even the rustle of leaves seemed muted, as if the forest itself held its breath. Lena felt an inexplicable weight pressing down on her, an urge to turn back, but curiosity propelled her onward. The path twisted sharply, and as she rounded a corner, a sudden chill ran down her spine. There, nestled among the underbrush, was a patch of vibrant crimson flowers, blooming defiantly against the encroaching darkness. They looked otherworldly, their petals almost glowing in the dim light. Lena knelt, captivated, reaching out to touch one. But as her fingers brushed the delicate surface, the air around her rippled, and a low whisper swept through the trees, sending a shiver coursing through her. "Turn back," the voice seemed to hiss, barely audible, like a warning carried on the wind. Lena froze, her breath hitching in her throat. She looked around, scanning the shadows, but found only the trees standing sentinel, their branches swaying slightly as if in response to her unease. Was it her imagination? Shaking off the fear that threatened to consume her, Lena pressed on, yet the whispers grew louder as she continued down the path, becoming a chorus of haunting echoes that followed her every step. They swirled around her, teasing her thoughts, murmuring in a language she couldn't comprehend. With each word, they tugged at the fringes of her sanity, straining her resolve. Then, without warning, the path forked, leading her toward two indistinguishable directions. Both sides looked the same, shrouded in the mist that had now thickened, making the trees appear like ghostly figures standing in judgment. A sense of dread crept into her bones as Lena hesitated, contemplating which way to go. The path to the right seemed to beckon with a soft glow, while the left was cloaked in shadows, a void that seemed to draw her in. Compelled by an unseen force, Lena chose the right path, feeling a strange resonance in her chest as she walked. But as she progressed, the forest transformed around her. The once familiar flora became grotesque, twisted and gnarled, leaves sprouting in unnatural angles, resembling claws reaching out to ensnare her. The air turned cold, sending a shiver racing down her spine, and she glanced back, half expecting to see the shadows gaining on her. Suddenly, a rustling came from the underbrush, making her heart leap into her throat. She spun around, eyes wide, but found nothing, only the whispering trees swaying as if in laughter, the sound reverberating in her ears. The forest felt alive, a sentient entity observing her every move, waiting for her to slip. With a mounting sense of urgency, she continued down the path, desperate to find her way out. But the shadows danced in her peripheral vision, flitting just out of reach, and the whispers became taunting, echoing her fears and doubts. They seemed to wrap around her, tightening their grip like a noose, pulling her deeper into their grasp. Lena's breath quickened. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the ground was conspiring against her. The once enchanting forest was morphing into a maze of nightmares, and she could no longer shake the feeling that she was being hunted. The path twisted further, leading her to a clearing where the trees parted, revealing an ominous sight, the very spring she had sought in her dreams. But this place was different, tainted by the weight of unseen eyes. The water lay still and dark, reflecting the eerie twilight above, and a chill crept into her bones as she realized she had arrived at a place where nature's beauty masked an unsettling truth. As Lena approached the spring, the shadows coalesced into shapes, dark and indistinct, flitting among the trees. Each flicker sent chills racing down her spine, whispering words she couldn't quite grasp. The air crackled with tension, the very atmosphere charged with a sense of danger that had left her breathless. She was no longer just a curious botanist. She had become an intruder in a realm governed by the unseen. As the shadows grew bolder, swirling closer, Lena understood that Valewood was not merely a forest. It was a living entity, an ancient force that demanded respect. And she had unwittingly stepped into its heart, where the lines between reality and nightmare began to blur. With her heart pounding in her chest and the whispers wrapping around her mind, Lena stood at the precipice of the unknown, unaware of the true horror that awaited her in the depths of Valewood. As Lena stepped closer to the spring, the air thickened, carrying with it an oppressive weight that made her stomach twist. The water shimmered under the dim light, dark and inviting, its surface undisturbed, yet pulsating with an energy that seemed almost sentient. She crouched down, peering into the depths, but the reflection staring back at her was not just her own. A shadowy figure lurked beneath the surface, flickering in and out of sight like a dying flame. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling, barely breaking the silence that had enveloped the clearing. It echoed back at her, a hollow mockery of her presence. The figure in the water rippled, sending waves across the surface, distorting her reflection into something grotesque. Panic surged through her, but curiosity held her in place, drawing her closer. Just then, a gust of wind whipped through the clearing, sending a shiver down her spine. The trees creaked and groaned, their branches twisting ominously as if trying to warn her. Lena felt a prickling at the back of her neck, an instinctual realization that she was not alone. The whispers intensified, rising in a frenzied crescendo, each voice more insistent than the last, as if urging her to flee. Heart pounding, she turned her back to the spring and took a step away, but the air thickened around her, pressing against her chest. The shadows at the edge of the clearing elongated and shifted, coalescing into darker shapes that lurked just beyond the light. They seemed to beckon her, their whispers merging into a single voice. "Stay with us. Join us." Lena's instincts screamed at her to run, but she found herself rooted to the spot, entranced by the allure of the unknown. The shadows moved closer, and she felt their cold breath on her skin, chilling her to the bone. In that moment of terror, she caught a glimpse of their forms, human yet distorted, faces twisted in expressions of longing and despair, mouths opening and closing in silent screams. As if pulled by an invisible force, she stumbled back toward the spring, drawn in by a compulsion she couldn't resist. The water shimmered, revealing glimpses of the past, images of others who had come before her, their faces etched with fear, their bodies fading into the depths of the dark water. The realization struck her like a bolt of lightning. These were the lost souls of Valewood, trapped in a cycle of eternal longing, forever tied to the forest curse. Desperation clawed at her throat as she fought against the tide of fear that threatened to drown her. Lena turned and sprinted back along the path, her feet pounding against the ground as she raced to escape the haunting echoes. The forest responded to her panic, branches snapping underfoot and shadows flaring out as if to grab her. But she pushed forward, heart racing with a singular focus. Yet the force was alive. With every frantic step, the path twisted and turned, leading her deeper into its heart rather than out. The trees shifted as if rearranging themselves to keep her contained, and Lena found herself in a maze of darkness, the faint light of the clearing fading behind her. Breathless and disoriented, she stumbled into another clearing, a vast expanse dominated by an enormous oak tree, its trunk gnarled and twisted, roots snaking across the ground like ancient serpents. Surrounding the tree was a ring of ferns, their dark, glossy leaves unfurling like the hands of the damned, beckoning her closer to the altar at the base. The air was thick with a heavy silence, the whispers fading into an anticipatory stillness. As she approached, she felt a presence wash over her, a palpable energy that radiated from the oak, the heart of the forest pulsing with life. And there, at the foot of the tree, was the man. He emerged from the shadows, gaunt and hollow, his eyes deep wells of darkness reflecting the secrets of Valewood. His mouth moved, but no sound came out, only the rustle of leaves in the stillness. Lena froze, a cold dread gripping her heart. "Why are you here?" he finally spoke, his voice a low rasp that seemed to echo through the clearing, reverberating off the trees. "You've come to claim what was never meant to be yours." Lena's mind raced, struggling to comprehend the weight of his words. "I just wanted to study the fern. I didn't mean to intrude," she stammered, her voice shaking as she took a step back. "Curiosity has led you here, but knowledge comes at a price," he warned, his gaze piercing into her soul. "This forest holds more than mere plants. It is a realm of lost souls, an entity that consumes the curious and the foolish." Lena's heart sank as the truth settled in. She was not the first to venture into Valewood, and she might not be the last. The realization hit her like a tidal wave. She was surrounded by the remnants of those who had come before, their spirits entwined with the ferns, bound to the forest for eternity. The shadows that had been lurking began to swell, coalescing into a mass of despair, the whispers rising once more in a frenzied chorus of haunting lament. They reached for her, their outstretched hands clawing at the air as if pleading for release. Panic surged through Lena as she realized that the very forest she had admired was now an inescapable trap. "No, I won't join you," she shouted, defiance breaking free as she turned to flee. But the shadows surged forward, their cold tendrils wrapping around her ankles, pulling her down. The earth trembled beneath her, and the air crackled with energy as the ancient oak groaned, its roots shifting as if alive, seeking to bind her to its dark history. Desperation clawed at her throat as she fought against the pull, her thoughts racing for a way to escape. The shadows closed in, whispering promises of knowledge and eternal peace. And for a moment, Lena felt the temptation sink into her heart, a promise of understanding that could transcend her fears. But the vision of the lost souls lingered in her mind, their silent screams echoing in the depths of her soul. With every ounce of strength, she broke free from the shadow's grip and stumbled back, gasping for breath. But the forest retaliated, its whispers growing louder, the shadows morphing into a monstrous shape, reaching for her with a ravenous hunger. As Lena turned to run, she caught one last glimpse of the man, his hollow eyes filled with both pity and despair. "You cannot escape what you've awakened," he called after her, his voice fading into the cacophony of whispers. The path twisted in chaos, the shadows chasing her relentlessly as she fought against the darkness that sought to claim her. Lena's only thought was to escape Valewood, but the forest had already marked her, a choice made, a pact sealed. And as she plunged deeper into the abyss, the heart of darkness closed in around her, leaving behind the remnants of a world she once knew, now lost to the seductive call of the ancient woods. Lena's heart pounded in her chest as she raced through the maze of trees, the whispers echoing in her mind like a relentless tide. The shadows pursued her, their cold fingers brushing against her skin, leaving trails of ice in their wake. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the very earth conspired against her, dragging her back toward the ancient oak in its sinister embrace. Desperation clawed at her throat, and Lena could hear the echoes of those who had come before, their cries resonating in her ears, a cacophony of warnings and regrets woven into the very fabric of the forest. "Turn back," they urged. Before it's too late. But Lena was past the point of no return. The forest had ensnared her, and she could feel the suffocating grip of its darkness tightening around her. As she stumbled through the underbrush, the path shifted, morphing into a twisted version of itself. Trees loomed like sentinels, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands, blocking her escape. The shadows loomed larger, their forms indistinct yet haunting, whispering words that wrapped around her mind like tendrils of smoke, promising secrets and revelations if only she would listen. With each frantic step, Lena's thoughts spiraled into chaos. What had drawn her into this hellish landscape? The pursuit of knowledge, the allure of the fern, or something deeper, an insatiable hunger to understand the mysteries of the world, no matter the cost? She fought against the panic rising within her, desperate to cling to her sanity, to remember the girl who had once wandered these woods with wonder and curiosity. But as she pushed onward, the shadows began to shift, their forms solidifying into faces, pale, hollow eyes staring back at her, mouths opening and closing in a silent wail of despair. She recognized some of them, researchers, adventurers, all entangled in the forest web. Their expressions were etched with the weight of their choices, the realization that they too had become part of Valewood's haunting narrative. "Help us," one of the figures whispered, their voice a chilling echo that pierced through her fear. "Free us from this prison." But how? The question gnawed at her, clawing at her resolve. Could she truly help them, or would she succumb to the same fate? Lena pressed on, driven by an instinctual need to escape, to break free from the suffocating darkness that sought to envelop her. Yet the forest had a way of turning in on itself, paths leading back to where she had started, each twist and turn feeling more familiar, yet more sinister. The trees whispered her name, calling her deeper into their embrace, promising answers that felt just out of reach. Suddenly, she burst into another clearing, gasping for air. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over a circle of ancient stones. Each stone bore symbols of long-forgotten languages, their surfaces covered in a slick, dark substance that shimmered like oil in the moonlight. A sense of foreboding washed over her as she realized she stood at the heart of something greater, a place of rituals, of sacrifices made to the forest's dark power. The whispers intensified, swirling around her like a tempest. "You must make a choice," they chanted, their voices rising in urgency. "Join us or perish." Lena felt the weight of their words pressing down on her, a suffocating reality that loomed over her like the very branches of the trees. With trembling hands, she approached the stones, tracing her fingers over the symbols that seemed to pulse with energy. Visions flooded her mind, images of those who had come before, drawn into the forest's seductive grasp, their dreams twisted into nightmares. They had sought knowledge only to become part of a dark tapestry woven into the very essence of Valewood. "What do you want from me?" she shouted, her voice breaking the silence, a desperate plea against the cacophony. But the whispers grew louder, an overwhelming force that threatened to drown her. "Sacrifice," they cried, their voices intertwining into a haunting melody. "A sacrifice must be made to set us free." Lena stumbled back, the realization hitting her like a wave. She was being offered a choice, herself or someone else, a price for the knowledge she had sought. As the shadows pressed closer, she felt the tendrils of despair wrapping around her heart, squeezing tighter. They were counting on her to make a decision, to join them in their eternal suffering or to doom them to remain in this hell. The thought twisted her stomach, a knot of guilt and fear binding her to the spot. "Please, you can't do this," she cried out, tears streaming down her cheeks as the faces of the lost souls turned toward her, their expressions a mix of hope and desperation. "I can't bear this. I didn't come here to harm anyone." But the forest was relentless. The shadows coiled tighter, their whispers rising to a deafening roar. "You will choose," they insisted, the energy in the clearing crackling with intensity. Lena felt her mind fraying at the edges, the walls of her reality crumbling under the weight of their demands. In that moment of despair, something deep within her stirred, a flicker of defiance ignited by the realization that she could not let the darkness consume her, nor could she sacrifice another for her own freedom. With newfound determination, Lena stepped back from the stones, refusing to give in to their demands. "I will not choose," she declared, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. I will find another way." As she spoke those words, the ground trembled, and the shadows recoiled, the whispers faltering as if her defiance had pierced through the suffocating veil of darkness. The ancient oak's roots began to writhe, shaking as though awakening from a long slumber. The lost souls wailed in protest, their pleas merging into a haunting chorus of anguish. Lena turned and ran, heart pounding, as she tore through the clearing, navigating the maze of trees that now shifted and twisted like serpents. The forest seemed to respond to her resolve, branches snapping underfoot, but the path before her becoming clearer, as if the ancient entity that governed Valewood had acknowledged her determination. But as she fled, the darkness remained hot on her heels, a relentless force that refused to let go. The shadows morphed and twisted, reaching for her with a desperate hunger, determined to drag her back into their depths. The cries of the lost echoed in her ears, mixing with the whispers that urged her to stay, to submit. "No," she shouted, adrenaline coursing through her veins. "I refuse to be part of your nightmare." Lena's vision blurred with tears, but she focused on the path ahead, the darkness swirling around her like a tempest. The further she ran, the more the whispers faded, replaced by the rustling leaves and distant sounds of the outside world, their haunting melodies losing their grip. But even as she dashed through the trees, Lena could feel the darkness clinging to her, a mark left behind by her journey into the heart of Valewood. The forest would not forget her, nor would it easily let her go. In her desperate bid for freedom, Lena realized she was not merely running away, she was fighting for her very soul. The forest had a hold on her, a connection that threatened to bind her to its dark legacy. And as she burst through the tree line, gasping for air under the pale light of the moon, she understood that while she had escaped the immediate danger, Valewood would forever linger in her mind, its shadows waiting patiently for the day she might return. The fight was far from over. The true horror of the forest was yet to unfold, a reminder that some mysteries are never meant to be uncovered. Lena stumbled into the open air, the cool breeze washing over her like a baptism, the oppressive weight of Valewood lifting from her shoulders. She had escaped the dark heart of the forest, but the remnants of the shadows lingered in her mind, the whispers now an unsettling echo that refused to fade. As she looked back at the tree line, a shiver raced down her spine, the trees standing like silent sentinels, watching, waiting. With each step away from the forest, the memories of her harrowing journey flooded back. The faces of the lost souls haunted her thoughts, their hollow eyes pleading for release. She felt the pull of their despair, a silent promise that the forest would not be satisfied until it claimed another. But Lena was determined to break free from Valewood's grasp. The truth gnawed at her, a secret hidden deep within the forest's shadows. She had to understand the forest's history, the dark rituals that had bound the souls to its depths. If she could uncover the mystery, perhaps she could set them free. Perhaps she could reclaim her own freedom as well. Days passed as she returned to her studies, the outside world seeming foreign and distant. Yet Valewood lingered in her mind like a dark cloud. The ferns she had once sought, now a reminder of the horror she had encountered. The whispers followed her, soft murmurs that echoed in the silence, a constant reminder of her brush with the otherworldly. Driven by an insatiable need for answers, Lena delved into research, poring over ancient texts and records. She discovered tales of Valewood, a place once revered for its beauty, now cursed by the greed of those who sought its secrets. The ferns, once thought to hold the key to immortality, were the roots of the forest's power, a source of life that demanded a steep price. As she studied, Lena learned of the ancient rituals performed to appease the forest, sacrifices made to the dark entity that governed Valewood. Each offering had drawn the forest deeper into its own shadows, binding the souls of those who had trespassed into a cycle of suffering. Lena realized that she was not merely an observer. She was part of the narrative woven into Valewood's dark tapestry, an unwitting player in a game far older than herself. Determined to right the wrongs, Lena returned to the edge of Valewood, her heart pounding as she stepped back into the haunting embrace of the trees. The air was thick with tension, the whispers now a low hum that resonated through her bones. She felt the weight of the forest's gaze upon her, the shadows coiling at her feet like restless serpents. With each step deeper into the woods, Lena felt the energy shift around her, the forest alive with anticipation. She approached the ancient oak, its gnarled trunk standing like a sentinel, roots extending into the earth like fingers grasping for lost souls. The clearing felt charged with an electric energy, as if the very essence of the forest was aware of her presence, a living entity waiting for her to fulfill her destiny. "Let me make amends," she whispered to the tree, her voice barely breaking through the thick silence. "Let me free those who are trapped." In response, the shadows writhed, coalescing into the forms of those who had come before, their expressions shifting from despair to hope as they surrounded her. Lena steeled herself, a sense of purpose igniting within her. She had come to realize that she needed to make a choice, not just for herself, but for all the souls bound to Valewood. With trembling hands, she placed her palm against the ancient oak, feeling its heartbeat echo through her body. "I offer myself as a sacrifice," she declared, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "I will give my life to release you." The shadows shifted, their forms swirling closer, the whispers rising into a frenzied crescendo. "No," they cried, their voices rising in protest. "You are not meant to bear this burden." But Lena stood firm, drawing strength from the knowledge that she had come to understand. The forest was not just a place of darkness. It was a realm of balance, a delicate equilibrium that had been shattered by greed and betrayal. To restore that balance, she had to become part of the cycle, to give back what had been taken. As she uttered the final words of her sacrifice, the forest trembled, the air crackling with energy. A brilliant light enveloped her, the shadows swirling in a chaotic dance, their cries fading into a haunting harmony. She felt herself being pulled into the heart of the forest, the light consuming her, enveloping her in a cocoon of warmth and peace. In that moment, Lena realized she was not just giving herself to the darkness. She was becoming part of something greater, a force of nature that would restore balance to Valewood. The weight of the whispers lifted, replaced by a serene understanding that she had not only freed the lost souls, but also herself. As the light dimmed, Lena found herself standing in the clearing once more. But the shadows had receded, leaving behind a sense of tranquility. The ancient oak stood strong, its roots entwined with the ferns, their vibrant colors glowing under the moonlight. The forest had transformed, its energy renewed, the balance restored. And as she looked around, Lena saw the faces of those who had been lost, their expressions now peaceful, a grateful light illuminating their features. They nodded to her, in acknowledgement of the sacrifice she had made, the bond that had been forged in the depths of Valewood. With a final glance at the ancient trees, Lena took a deep breath, her heart swelling with purpose. She had faced the darkness and emerged stronger, not just for herself, but for all those who had come before her. Valewood would forever be part of her, a reminder of the power of sacrifice, the importance of balance, and the dark allure of knowledge. As she stepped back into the world beyond the trees, Lena felt the whispers fade into a gentle breeze, a promise that the forest would endure, its secrets preserved and its beauty forever intertwined with the lives it had touched. And with that, she walked away, leaving behind the shadows of Valewood, carrying its legacy within her, a guardian of its truths, ready to share the stories that would echo through time. The Brandt family pulled into the gravel driveway of the old country house as the sun dipped behind the horizon, casting long shadows that danced eerily across the landscape. The house stood like a sentinel amidst towering pines, its paint peeling and windows clouded with age. Laughter erupted from Lily, the youngest, as she jumped out of the car, her breath forming tiny clouds in the cool evening air. David, her father, followed, unloading the luggage, while Sarah, her mother, took a moment to breathe in the fresh, crisp scent of pine mixed with something earthy and damp. As they settled in, the interior felt like stepping back in time. Dust motes floated in the fading light, and the wooden floorboards creaked underfoot, whispering secrets of the past. The walls were adorned with faded photographs, ghostly smiles from a bygone era, their eyes seeming to follow the family as they moved. While Sarah busied herself in the kitchen preparing a simple dinner, David and Lily explored the sprawling grounds. The deepening twilight brought an unexpected chill. As they ventured closer to the edge of the woods, the rustling leaves seemed to murmur, almost beckoning them forward. "It's just the wind," David reassured Lily when she hesitated, glancing back at the looming trees. The forest, dark and dense, held an allure that was hard to resist, yet it felt ominous. as if shadows danced just out of sight, aware of their presence. Night descended, wrapping the house in a blanket of darkness. They gathered around the crackling fire pit in the backyard, roasting marshmallows under a canopy of stars. The night felt alive, every rustle and distant chirp a reminder that they were not alone. But then, like a chilling draft that sweeps through an open window, the laughter faded, replaced by a distant, haunting cry. At first, they thought it might be a wild animal, perhaps a deer or a fox in distress. But the sounds morphed into something more human, a desperate call that pierced the stillness of the night. "Help us! Help us!" The cries echoed through the trees, wrapping around them like tendrils of fear. Lily's wide eyes darted toward her parents. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. David and Sarah exchanged glances, their smiles faltering. They had come seeking peace, but now dread slithered through the air, thick and palpable. "It's probably just some kids playing a prank," David said, trying to sound confident, but uncertainty dripped from his words. The shadows seemed to lean closer, pressing in on them. After a moment of uncomfortable silence, Lily broke the tension. "Can we check it out?" The words hung heavy in the air, igniting a spark of curiosity that battled against instinctual caution. Against their better judgment, the family decided to investigate, their hearts pounding with a mix of excitement and fear. As they left the warmth of the fire behind, flashlights in hand, they ventured toward the edge of the woods, unaware of the true darkness that awaited them. The forest loomed ahead, twisted and alive, as the cries grew louder, drawing them deeper into the unknown. As the Brandt family stepped into the woods, the world behind them faded into a murmur, the comforting crackle of the fire replaced by the whisper of leaves and the rustling underbrush. The moonlight barely penetrated the thick canopy above, creating a labyrinth of shadows that danced like specters, teasing their senses. With each step deeper into the woods, a chill crawled up their spines, an instinctive warning that they were venturing into a place where time and reality twisted together. The cries grew more distinct, a symphony of desperation that echoed off the trees, making it hard to determine their origin. "Help us! Help us!" The words slithered through the air, resonating with a primal fear that made the hair on the back of their necks stand up. David led the way, his flashlight beam slicing through the darkness, revealing the gnarled trunks of ancient trees, their branches stretching out like skeletal fingers, reaching for something unseen. "Do you think someone's really out here?" Sarah asked, her voice quaking. Despite the growing anxiety, the family pressed on, driven by a mix of concern and the thrill of the unknown. Lily, gripping her flashlight tightly, could feel the weight of the shadows closing in around them, but her curiosity outweighed her fear. As they moved further from the safety of the house, the path became obscured by underbrush, the ground soft and yielding beneath their feet. The cries transformed into a cacophony of pleas, echoing in their minds and tugging at their hearts. "Don't leave us. We need you." The sounds twisted around them, reverberating through the trees, wrapping around them like cold tendrils, urging them forward. "What if we find someone?" Lily exclaimed, her excitement overshadowing her growing trepidation. David, too, felt the urge to reassure her, but the pit in his stomach tightened. "We'll help them," he promised, though the words tasted bitter on his tongue. They continued deeper into the woods, disoriented by the dense foliage that closed in around them. The cries became a haunting melody that pulled at their sanity, weaving together fear and hope. With each passing moment, the darkness morphed from an enchanting backdrop into an oppressive entity, suffocating their spirits. "Wait, where's the path?" Sarah asked, glancing back. The way they came had vanished, swallowed by the gnarled roots and shadows that seemed to shift and breathe. Panic bubbled beneath the surface as they spun around, their flashlights flickering in the thickening darkness, the beam barely illuminating the surrounding chaos. "Stay close," David ordered, though his own voice trembled as he felt the weight of unseen eyes watching them from the depths of the woods. Just then, a sharp crack echoed through the trees, a branch snapping, or perhaps something more sinister lurking nearby. They froze, their breath hitching in their throats. "Maybe we should turn back," Lily whispered, her youthful bravado fading under the weight of dread. But before they could react, the cries intensified, piercing through the silence like a knife. "Help us! We're lost, please!" Something in the tone of the voices changed, a raw edge of desperation that struck deep within their hearts. The family exchanged fearful glances, their instincts warring against the urge to help. David took a step forward, the urge to seek out the source of the cries overwhelming him. "Let's just see what it is," he said, though doubt gnawed at him. "We can't leave someone in trouble." With a deep breath, they pressed forward, the oppressive darkness swallowing them whole. Each step was a leap into uncertainty, every shadow a reminder of the haunting presence that surrounded them. As they moved deeper, the trees began to twist unnaturally, their branches clawing at the sky, as if warning them to turn back. Yet drawn by the calls for help, they ventured deeper still, unaware that they were not the hunters, but the hunted, lost in a web spun by the very forest that was calling to them. The air grew thick with an unsettling energy, a weight that pressed against their chests. The deeper the Brandt family ventured into the heart of the Eldridge Woods, the more the air thickened with an unshakable sense of dread. The cries morphed into a twisted chorus of anguish that surrounded them, each plea seeming to emanate from the very trees themselves. Shadows danced at the edge of their vision, flickering and darting like phantoms, their presence unsettling yet undeniable. Finally, they emerged into a clearing, illuminated only by the pale light of the moon filtering through the dense branches above. The sight that greeted them was both surreal and horrifying. Ethereal figures drifted in the mist, their forms flickering like candle flames caught in a draft. They were not quite human, their faces were a grotesque blend of hope and despair, their mouths moving silently as they reached out with outstretched hands. "Help us! Please help us!" they whispered, their voices a haunting echo that filled the air, wrapping around the Brandts like a shroud. The family stood frozen, their hearts pounding as they absorbed the weight of the scene before them. These were the souls they had heard calling, lost and trapped in a limbo between life and death. What is this place?" Sarah's voice trembled, and as she gripped Lily's hand tightly, her instincts screaming to flee. David, too, felt the creeping horror of the situation, but was rooted in place, compelled by a mix of compassion and fear. He could see the sorrow etched into the faces of the lost souls, their eyes filled with a longing that stirred something deep within him. "Mom, look!" Lily gasped, pointing to a woman hovering nearby, her features contorted in pain. "She looks like she's crying." The woman's mouth moved, forming silent words of desperation, and David felt an inexplicable urge to approach. "We can't leave them," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They need us." But even as he spoke, a part of him recognized the danger in those words. "David, we need to go back," Sarah pleaded, her voice shaking. These aren't just lost people. They're trapped." The atmosphere shifted, an unholy energy coursing through the clearing, wrapping around them like a tightening noose. But the lost souls began to move closer, their cries becoming an agonizing blend of despair and hope. "Don't leave us! Help us find peace!" The sorrow in their voices was palpable, pulling at the very core of their humanity. Lily, overcome with empathy, took a step forward, her heart aching for the souls before her. "What happened to you?" she asked, her innocent curiosity cutting through the tension. The spirits halted, their hollow eyes locking onto her, and for a moment, silence reigned. Then a tall figure, cloaked in shadow, stepped forward, the whispers dying down to a hush. "We were once like you," it said, its voice low and resonant, filled with a profound sadness. "We wandered these woods, seeking help, lost in our own despair." A cold shiver ran down David's spine as the figure continued. "We reached out for help, but the darkness took us, binding us to this place. We cannot move on." With each word, the oppressive energy grew, wrapping around the Brandts like a vice. The shadows lengthened, and the air became stifling, laden with the weight of unfulfilled desires. The forest seemed to pulse with a malevolent life of its own, closing in around them. "Please, don't abandon us," the woman cried, her voice a chilling echo that resonated within David's chest. The family felt the pull of empathy, a powerful urge to save these souls. But as they looked around, the realization struck them like a thunderbolt. These souls were trapped not just by the forest, but by their own despair, their regrets and fears binding them to this dark place. "Lily, we need to leave," Sarah urged, her voice rising in panic. "We can't help them." But the whispers began to swirl again, more insistent, digging into their memories, dredging up hidden fears and regrets. Help us! Don't leave us! The air thickened and the shadows writhed, taking on forms that felt all too familiar. Each family member began to confront their own darkest moments. David saw flashes of his professional failures. Sarah was haunted by memories of missed opportunities, and Lily felt the weight of insecurities that pressed against her heart. As they stood on the precipice of choice, the lost souls swirled around them, their mournful wails intertwining with their own fears. The family was caught in the web of the woods, suspended between the desire to help and the instinct for survival. The pull of the lost souls was intoxicating, promising closure, understanding, and an end to their suffering. But at what cost? The Brandt family found themselves ensnared in a nightmarish tableau, a collision of desperation and despair, where the line between reality and the supernatural blurred. The clearing, once a place of eerie beauty, had transformed into a chaotic vortex of emotions, shadows swirling around them like a tempest. Each lost soul now seemed to embody their darkest fears, their whispered pleas growing frantic as they sensed the family's hesitation. "Help us," the figures implored, their voices rising in a dissonant chorus that echoed through the trees, making the very ground tremble beneath the family's feet. "Don't leave us." The shadows deepened and the trees bent low, as if bowing to a power beyond comprehension. David felt the weight of the spirits pressing against him, their sorrow a palpable force. His heart raced as memories of his failures surfaced, moments when he had let others down, when he had been too afraid to reach out. He could almost feel the cold fingers of the spirits brushing against his skin, seeking to draw him in. The forest hummed with a malevolent energy, as though it thrived on the turmoil within him. "David, we need to get out of here." Sarah's voice trembled as she grasped Lily's hand, but even she struggled against the pull of the souls. The cries were no longer just pleas for help. They had morphed into a siren song, weaving into their minds, enticing them to surrender to the darkness. "We can't let it take us." As the family began to retreat, the shadows lunged forward, and the spirits transformed from pleading figures into twisted, anguished forms, their faces contorted in eternal suffering. David could see the deep lines of sorrow etched into their features, the vacant stares that spoke of endless nights lost in regret. The air thickened with despair, each breath a reminder of what lay ahead if they did not escape. "Please don't go," a voice cried out, a young girl's voice that mirrored Lily's own. The resemblance struck a nerve, and David hesitated, torn between the desire to save and the need to protect his family. The forest seemed to pulse with the weight of his indecision, every heartbeat echoing through the trees like a war drum. "Stay with us. You can help us find peace." The spirits circled closer, their forms flickering in and out of existence, the whispers rising in a crescendo that threatened to overwhelm them. The ground beneath their feet felt alive, a throbbing pulse that resonated with the energy of the lost souls, urging them to join in their eternal lament. Suddenly, the clearing darkened, shadows converging to form a tall, ominous figure, a specter of darkness that towered above the family, its face obscured by a shroud. "You have ventured too far, travelers," it intoned, its voice a haunting echo that reverberated in their bones. "You have heard the cries of the lost, and now you must decide. Will you join them in their eternal despair, or will you flee and condemn them to suffer alone?" The choice hung heavy in the air, suffocating them. Panic surged through David as he realized the gravity of their situation. They had wandered into a trap, a nexus of despair that thrived on their empathy, drawing them deeper into the web of lost souls. The darkness wrapped around them like a vice, each breath growing more labored as they struggled against the suffocating dread. "Lily, we can't stay," Sarah shouted, her voice breaking as she pulled her daughter closer. But the whispers were relentless, twisting memories of joy into sharp, painful reminders of loss. David saw visions of his daughter's future, of the dreams she had, the love she would one day find, all eclipsed by the weight of the past. The air crackled with tension as the spirits grew restless, their forms blurring and shifting, merging with the shadows. The specter's presence loomed larger, a dark harbinger of what awaited them if they chose to stay. "Join us," and we shall share our sorrow. Help us remember who we once were, it boomed, each word sending a jolt of cold fear through the family. Run, David finally shouted, breaking through the paralyzing fear. Grabbing Lily's hand, he turned and raced back through the clearing, the others following closely behind. But the shadows lunged, tendrils of darkness reaching for them, threatening to pull them back into the abyss. The whispers turned to screams, echoing through the woods, a cacophony of anguish that followed them as they dashed toward the tree line. The forest closed in around them, branches clawing at their clothes, as if the woods themselves were unwilling to let them escape. Each step was a battle against the darkness, a desperate fight for freedom as the cries of the lost souls faded into the distance, haunting echoes that promised they would never truly escape the weight of their choice. The Brandt family burst through the trees, emerging from the suffocating grip of the woods into the cold night air. Their hearts raced, adrenaline surging through their veins as they stumbled back toward the safety of the country house. The shadows that had clung to them began to recede, but the haunting whispers of the lost souls echoed in their minds, a relentless reminder of the choice they had made. As they reached the edge of the property, David turned to look back at the looming forest, now a dark silhouette against the moonlit sky. The cries had faded into the distance, but the weight of what they had witnessed hung heavily in the air. Did we do the right thing?" he murmured, uncertainty gnawing at him. "Of course we did," Sarah snapped, her voice laced with a mix of relief and pent-up fear. "We had to protect Lily. Those souls were trapped, but we can't let their pain drag us down too." But even as she spoke, doubt flickered in her eyes, an internal struggle that mirrored David's own. Lily stood between them, her small face pale and drawn, her innocence stripped away by the terror they had faced. "But they needed help," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They were just..." Her words pierced through the thick atmosphere, and the family fell silent, grappling with the enormity of their decision. Inside the house, the walls felt oppressive, a stark contrast to the freedom of the outdoors. The warm light of the fireplace flickered, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. As they gathered around it, the warmth failed to reach the chill deep within their bones. They had escaped the woods, but the remnants of the lost souls clung to their spirits like a shroud. David's thoughts spiraled as he replayed the events in his mind. The faces of the lost souls haunted him, their eyes filled with unending sorrow. What if they were right? What if they had the power to help them? The possibility gnawed at him like a festering wound, a regret that settled deep in his heart. "Do you think they'll be okay?" Lily asked, her eyes wide with worry. "What if we didn't help them enough?" "They're lost," Sarah said, trying to maintain her composure. "Sometimes you can't save everyone. We did what we could." But the tremor in her voice betrayed her uncertainty. The family fell into an uneasy silence, each member lost in their thoughts, wrestling with guilt and fear. As night deepened, the house creaked and groaned around them, the old wood seemingly alive with the echoes of the past. Shadows flickered in the corners of their vision, reminding them of the darkness they had narrowly escaped. Suddenly, a chilling gust of wind rattled the windows, and the flames in the fireplace flickered violently, casting eerie shapes on the walls. The family exchanged fearful glances, sensing a presence lurking just beyond the edges of their reality. The weight of their choice pressed down on them like a shroud, an unshakable reminder of the souls left behind. "Maybe we should go back," David finally said, his voice breaking the suffocating silence. "Maybe we can still help them." "No," Sarah replied, her voice firm, though panic shimmered just beneath the surface. "We can't go back into that darkness. We've already seen what it can do." But the doubt lingered, a palpable tension in the room that threatened to erupt. Lily, sensing the conflict, glanced at her parents, her small face twisted in confusion. "But what if they need us? What if they're still out there, lost and scared?" The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to thicken, coiling like smoke, and the air grew heavy with an unspeakable energy. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for their decision. David stood, torn between his role as protector and the urge to do something, anything to ease the suffering he had witnessed. "I can't shake the feeling that we abandoned them," he said, his voice trembling. "What if our escape comes at a time?" Just then a low, mournful wail echoed through the house, sending shivers down their spines. It was a sound that sent dread coursing through their veins, a reminder that they were not alone. The whispers of the lost souls seemed to seep through the very walls, filling the air with a heavy sorrow that echoed their own fears. "Please, help us," the voices called, reverberating through the house, their pain mingling with the family's own turmoil. In that moment, they realized the true cost of their decision. The souls they had left behind were now intertwined with their own fates, haunting them with the echoes of their choice. The Brandt family had escaped the physical darkness, but they could not escape the psychological grip of the lost soul's anguish. "Let's go back," David said, determination settling into his bones despite the fear coiling in his gut. "We can't just leave them. We have to try." "David, no," Sarah cried, but the desperation in his eyes was clear. They were drawn back into the darkness, unwilling to leave the souls to suffer alone, bound by an empathy that felt both burdensome and necessary. As they stepped out into the night once more, the forest loomed ahead, a dark portal waiting to envelop them. The cries grew louder, a symphony of despair that echoed through the trees, pulling them back into the depths of Eldridge Woods. This time, however, they would not go as lost souls themselves. They would confront the darkness, holding on to the hope that perhaps, just perhaps, they could help those who had been abandoned. And as they plunged into the darkness once more, the shadows welcomed them back, ready to weave their destinies into the fabric of the woods, forever entwined with the lost souls they had vowed to save.